Well, good morning, everybody. Corey, I don't know if I should be upset at you or thankful, but I mean, every song which is on the money, I feel like I don't even have to be up here today. Just perfect, ditto. I'm going to walk down. That's it. No, thank you so much for that. To you and Scott, it was a great Lord's Supper sermon. I think it will really set our minds well for the lesson today. And it's really just, I do want to say it's great to be back with you all. I had a very nice trip, a great couple of weeks, but it always feels good to kind of get back into routine, get back to work. I do feel like I need another week off to rest after my vacation and then get laundry done and get back caught up on work. But no, I'm very glad to be back with you all and to be able to get back to work. As I'm sure the cat's probably out of the bag, if you've talked to my grandma, I did get engaged over my trip, so it was a very successful trip. So I do have to be very thankful to everybody who helped out and stepped up and helped cover for me while I was gone. It ended up being a pretty important trip for me, one that I won't forget anytime soon. And thank you for all of you for all your understanding and your patience as you let me take a couple weeks off as I went to go take care of some business. So thank you very much. And I think today it'll actually be kind of fitting that this big event has happened in my life. I didn't plan it out like this. It just kind of happened. But I think it will go quite well with our emotion today. Now, last time I was up here, we ended on the theme of gratitude, which you all grabbed those 21 days of gratitude cards. So if you started that Sunday, you should have just 1 week left. So we're getting there. We're getting close to the end of the 21 days. And I'd really love to hear your feedback there. See how it's helping you, how it's affecting you, if you've seen any changes with that experiment. And I think this week's going to be a little bit different, though. You see, throughout this entire study, we've been focusing on a lot of positive emotions. We've been talking about comfort and peace and gratitude. But today is going to be run slightly different. One, in the fact that we're covering a more negative emotion and how we deal with that emotion. But two, instead of having a psalm that we'll go by and we'll try to really focus in on that, we're going to be looking at a couple different ones and pulling out different ideas from there while we really hone in on this emotion. And today we're going to be talking about loneliness. We're talking about loneliness, I think, because there's not a single soul who has never felt that emotion. We have all felt lonely or alone before. And we can start to feel alone all the time, whatever it is. Maybe it's a changing environment, maybe a move, right? Or maybe we just change, or we're growing, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a loss of a loved one, right? Where we start to feel alone, start to feel that loneliness as things around us start to diminish. Our lives can really start to beat us down and make us feel so alone. But I think one of the most beautiful gifts God has given us is that feeling lonely does not leave us alone. And I think Hebrews 4:15 puts it a lot more eloquently when it says this: "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." You see, even Jesus felt alone. And I think we can often take that for granted sometimes. Jesus, God incarnate, even him, he's able to sympathize with our pain as we start to go through these emotions of feeling alone. And I think it's why, while Jesus was on the cross, he quoted Psalm 22 with those very famous words. We all know the words, right? As he's up there, amidst all that agony, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me, turned your back on me? Why am I alone in this moment?" And while that seems like it could be a really pessimistic verse, I think there's a lot more behind that there's a whole lot more going on that can be far more encouraging than what might look like it is at face value. You see, Jesus is crying out to start to Psalm 22. It's meant to call our minds not just to what he's quoting there, but to the entire words of David in Psalm 22. It is meant to remind us of the truth when our feelings get in the way. Jesus is saying it is natural to feel alone, but there is a solution. There is a step we can take to righting this wrong in our lives. You see, Psalm 22 is not one of anger against God. It's not one about God forgetting us, but rather it is a man remembering that God is with him through everything, through his deepest tragedies. God is there, and that man redevoting his life to God. And in all honesty, this process here, I would say, without that, it can be the cause of a lot of negativity in our lives. You see, not just loneliness, but devastation, hatred, anger, depression, anxiety, all sorts of things can be boiled down to this one missing piece. And if you're wondering how one piece could change so much in your lives, I would urge you to do a puzzle, right? Our family is a big puzzle family. We've got one going on right now in the living room. And you see, when you're doing a puzzle, the absolute worst thing that can happen is not when you open the box and you realize there's way too many puzzle pieces. It's not when you're going through meticulously trying to sort everything out and putting loads and loads of time into it. It's when you finally get to the end and you realize you're missing one piece, right? When you're missing that one piece, it's the absolute worst feeling. Because all of a sudden, all that previous work means nothing. It doesn't matter if you just placed 999 pieces. If you are missing that 1,000th piece, what was the point of the puzzle? Why did we do it? You see, if we are missing that one piece, everything else is all for naught. And the truth is, unless we have the right piece, nothing else matters. And so as we talk about loneliness and what the solution to loneliness is, we cannot write off the significance one piece can have. Now, if you were to ask me why I chose to look at loneliness this week, I think that would be a pretty fair question, right? And I think part of it might be that, partnership is definitely on my mind at this time. Part of it is maybe that I've been missing you guys over the last couple of weeks. It's great to be back with you. Maybe it's, we're getting close to the end of our time here this summer, and I'm missing home a little bit. And I'm already thinking forward to how much I'll be missing you guys when I have to go back to Colorado. But really, I think it has to do with the reason I was baptized. You see, we are coming to the end of our time here today, and I am really focused and trying to focus on what messages I want to get across to you guys. And I figured I'd start or kind of end, I guess, with one of the most impactful moments in my entire life, and that was the day I was baptized. And you see, this August will mark the 9-year anniversary of my family moving from the Bay Area, California, to Colorado, where we are now, which is crazy to think. It doesn't feel like it's been 9 years. And while that place, while my home seems so familiar to me now, it is strange to think that there was a time where it felt like a complete wilderness, where I knew nothing. It was completely uncomfortable. This fall also marks, though, the 9-year anniversary of me getting baptized. And I think it's important for me to look back. Although it's hard for me to think of a time when my home seemed so foreign, it's important for me to remember the state of mind I was in when I made that decision. You see, when we moved, it was a big change for me. We ended up staying with a couple from the church who, at this point now, they're like family to us. We treat them like cousins, but there was a time when they were basically strangers, and we had just met them. The first time I saw their faces was when I walked through the door, and then I was living in their basement. And it was a strange time. It was a strange house, strange people. And at that same time, I was also starting a new school that, apart from having new people and new friends that I had to make, also was the start of middle school. And so I also had to try to figure out what that was like. And I don't think anybody has ever enjoyed that transition from elementary school to middle school. It was just a very strange time. New people, a new home, a new environment, a new school. And it was hard for me. It was definitely challenging to try to figure out who I was, right? Where I belonged. And in all of those inconsistencies, there were really two things that were consistencies in my life. Two things that I look back to, and that those were my daily routines. And one of them was after school, every single day, I would walk down the street to the local ice cream shop, and I would get an ice cream. They also did breakfast burritos for some reason, so I do one of those too. And I'd just get some homework done while I had some food, and I waited for my sister to get out of school, for our mom to pick us up and go back home. And then there was a much more impactful consistency that really changed my life quite a bit. You see, every night, after my family had gone to bed, I'd be lying awake, and I would just kind of be thinking to myself about everything that changed, all the new things in my life, just kind of muttering to myself, listing out everything that had changed. And it was tough, but I think eventually I started to try to make a change. And it was a very slight change. Instead of just talking to myself about all these changes, I decided, well, maybe I'll start just telling to God. He knows everything that's changed, but maybe it'll help me just to have someone I can talk to in this moment. And so I very slowly started to change these deranged, quiet mutterings to myself to just prayers to God, where I was confessing these struggles I was going through, about feeling alone, feeling uncertain about what the future may hold. And that was it was probably the best decision of my life. Because one night, as I started to pray more, a kind of light bulb moment happened for me. I remember it very clearly that the moonlight kind of came through the big glass doors from the walkout basement, and it was like this full-on light bulb moment just shining down. And I realized something. As I was listing all these changes in my life, there was one thing that could never change. And it wasn't my family, right? Although they were still with me, it wasn't my family. It wasn't myself. I knew that I was changing in that very moment. But it was God. God was the one thing that I could rely on through every single moment. And so after a couple conversations with my parents, I ended up being baptized a few days later for that very reason. And it's really fun looking back on that time, because a couple of years later, they ended up changing that ice cream shop to where it's completely different. They stopped selling food. They stopped having games up at the front. They shrunk it down real small. And yet, God is still the most important part of my life. And He needs to be for the rest of my life. And He has never changed. Although I have changed quite a bit. I have changed drastically. I have turned either which way. I have failed and I have grown. God has never changed through it all. And although it's very simple, that's the key to loneliness. It is complete submission to God, a dedication to partnering myself to the one thing that could never change. And looking back, it's easy to see where I started to go wrong. I tried to find comfort in all of the wrong things. I wanted to find comfort in my home, which obviously was changing drastically. We actually had to move. A little side tangent. As we were staying in the basement of our friends, they moved, and so we had to move with them into their other basement. And so even my home was changing twice over. I was going from place to place. Nothing was certain. I tried to find comfort in my school and in my friends, and I'll tell you what, middle school friends are not very reliable. They change like crazy. I mean, I'm sure we could do a raise of hands to see how many people are still very close with their middle school best friends, and I'm sure there wouldn't be too many hands up. I tried to rely on my family too. And while they helped me so much, they couldn't do everything. You see, we cannot value even the people in our lives. The people that God put in our lives for moments like that, more than God. God must be number one. You see, yes, we should love and serve all people, but if we are more concerned with pleasing even fellow Christians than we are with doing what God says, then we have it backwards. It is God first. And with partnership definitely being on my mind lately, I need to continually make myself go back to this moment. I need to remind myself that no relationship, not even my marriage, that this lifetime commitment can be more important than God. It can't be the cure to loneliness. Only God can be the cure. These other relationships, whether it's any single relationship, must be assets to that first commitment. It all must go back to God. Every part of me must go back to that commitment I made 9 years ago. The commitment of my life through baptism. And really, this is the solution to loneliness, no matter what the cause is. If it is a change in environment, a move like it was for me, if it was a change in yourself, or if it more drastically was a loss of a loved one, which if I didn't have that commitment with God, later on in my life when I have faced more loss, I don't know how I would face those things without God right by my side. You see, nothing can fill the void of loneliness except God. The only one that can be by your side in every trial is God. Your friends and your families will do their best, but no one's best can even come close to God. In fact, looking at others in the same, trying to find comfort in others, in the same way we try to find comfort in God, will bring benefit for nobody. It is just needless stress that we put on those relationships. And if we try to find comfort in ourselves, we say, oh, I don't need anybody, I can do it alone. That is also the wrong choice. Because we too will fail. We too will let ourselves down. It must be God at the top always, nothing else. Now, I've been talking a lot about submitting, but I want to now shift to what does that actually look like? What does it look like to submit to God? Because submission comes in different forms, right? We've been talking about relationships, and there should be a level of submission in many relationships. But what does it look like to have a complete and total submission to God alone? And if we want to work on fully submitting to God, I think we should know some of the differences between these things. See, for instance, there is a natural submission with God, one that comes from the recognition of creation versus creator. And while we can get into a nice long debate about AI, the truth is the creator will always be greater than the creation, right? Creator, creation. And so naturally, there is a difference between us and God that puts us in submission. It's something that goes beyond the garden. You see, in the garden, us, man, we tried to take the place of God. And we failed, right? We tried to take the place of the Creator. And while it failed because of God's intervention, I think he intervened for our good. He intervened because he knew that the creation could never take the place of the Creator. He knew that if he did not step in, we would fail greatly. In fact, this is the same thing we see God talk to Job about. At the very end of Job, Job is talking to God saying, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you help me? And God looks at Job and kind of just shakes his head and goes, what are you talking about? Who do you think you are? And he shows him the entire universe, the entire galaxy, everything, down to the finest, smallest atom. And he says, do you think you could handle all of this? Do you think you could control all of this? We can't. And God knows that. And so he helps us by being our creator. And if we ever want more, because we are confined by this world and this life, but if we want more than this life, then we need to rely on the one who created so much more, who was around before this life. We must do as Psalm 22 says, and acknowledge our place on this earth compared to our Creator. I've mentioned it a couple times already, but Psalm 22, 6 through 10 says this. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. We are worms compared to God. He has the power to form us just as he did the fabric of reality. And so, of course, we are subject to him. Because he created us. You see, I could cry all I want about being born on September 12th, but really, that's out of my hands. I am the creation. I don't have any control over that. But in all honesty, that is the most surface level form of submission. Because while I can and should acknowledge that it's natural to be less than God, the whole point is that I don't have the power to control my place under God. And if we're looking to give God the kind of submission he deserves, we need to do more than just be below him and start bowing down to him, choosing to submit. Now, there are other forms of submission that take action, that require conscious choice from me. And the first of which is the submission that comes from subject to ruler. The submission caused by power and authority. See, while these might seem like very similar things, the natural submission and the submission due to power and authority, there is a key difference. You see, I cannot fight my nature or my being. No matter how hard I work, who God made me is still who I am. But that doesn't mean I have to listen to him. Just because he created me does not mean I have to follow the path he laid out before me, and that's important to recognize. Because we are faced with choices to follow him every single day, faced with choices to submit to him every single day. You see, to use a word from our Wednesday night class, I have the choice of insubordination. Doesn't mean it's a good choice, but it is a choice. Take, for instance, a king, right? A king has power above his people, but his people still have to choose to bow down to him. Or to make it more applicable to our lives, we have laws here, right, in this nation. But it's still our choice if we want to follow those laws. Is it a good choice to probably break those laws? No. But it's still a choice. The thing is, though, that this kind of submission from authority is much different from what we see of the world. Right? It's not just blindly following laws. It's not just blindly following a ruler. See, in this life, we have been told to submit to rulers, but really there is a catch to that point. You see, Romans 13, 1-6 kind of talks about this submission to authorities a little bit. Romans 13, 1-6 reads this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for you. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." And if you look closely at verse 1, while it's saying we must be in subjection to governing authorities, it's really saying that subjecting to earthly kings is just subjecting ourselves to God's authority. That fighting against the authorities in place is actually fighting against God. And this is a hard point because it takes a genuine faith. The arrogant part of me wants to say that I know best. And if this person or that person were only in power, then life would be so much better for everybody. But the truth is, God has a plan. And even if I can't see the why, I must trust God's authority. I must remember that God has all power, all vision, and has a reason. My viewpoint is just a speck of dust compared to the infinite perspective of God. And that's why Paul takes the argument even further by saying that submission is not just a matter of being on God's good side, but rather it is vital for my conscience. Because once I recognize that all power belongs to God, how could I possibly withhold anything from that God? Once I recognize that God is in total control, why would I try to fight against that God? The standpoint of I need to look out for myself, or even I need to look out for my family and my friends, becomes faulty when I do not look for God to provide. When I forget the one with total authority, I am no longer helping myself and my loved ones. And while this makes it seem like it would be impossible to fight against subjugation or submission, do we not do this every single day? Do we not worry about plans that we cannot control? Do we not worry about the health and safety of those in the hands of God? Do we not make compromises with God, saying, well, I'm tired today, so maybe I'll go next week, or this congregation over here isn't really what God says that they should be doing, but I like the people there, or I like some of what they're doing. Or I'll just get as close to the line of sin as possible, but I won't cross it. See, that is not submission, though. Well, what part of that looks like submission? Getting as close to the line as possible. And the more we push boundaries to God, the more we fight against his total authority, the more we withhold from being totally and completely all in on God, the harder we make life. And the more lonely we will get. I touched on this briefly earlier, but I'll say it some more. When we put our hope in ourselves by trusting in our own solutions and our knowledge, or even when we put our hope in people, loved ones, friends, family, people who eventually will fail us, we are simply setting ourselves up to be let down. Because without God, there is no grace or mercy. Without God, there is no constant in our life. And so, when we look to other things such as marriages, our homes, our jobs, even other Christians, we will not find an eternal comfort, an eternal solace. Now, this is hard. It's easy to say God is number one in my life and my family is number two. But when hard times come, they will test if we mean it. If we are truly willing to sacrifice anything to be with God. But God's authority deserves submission. We must proclaim like David did in Psalm 31, 1 through 5, that was read earlier today. In you, O Lord, I put my trust. Let me never be ashamed. Deliver me in your righteousness. Bow down your ear to me. Deliver me speedily. Be my rock of refuge, a fortress of defense to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. Therefore, for your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me. For you are my strength. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord God of truth. Into your hand I commit my spirit. What does that truly look like? To commit my spirit into the hands of God. Because no one else can be my refuge. All else will crumble like sand. But God will be a fortress. And God deserves my total submission. Submission to the one who rules all is the key to life. Now, before we end today, I would like to bring up really quick a second source of submission that we may fall away from sometimes. And that's submission coming from the saved to the sacrifice. We have a debt. And it is our duty as the saved to try and pay back that debt. To present ourselves as living sacrifices because Christ laid his life down for us. But this goes beyond just following rules. Because of one simple fact. The Bible is not a book of morals. I think often we can read through it and think it's just a list of do's and do nots. It's a list of this is exactly how the life goes right here. But it's not a book of morals. While that is important and it's a huge chunk of it, it is not the main point. In fact, looking at it as a book of rights and wrongs will only hurt our walk with God. Instead, the main concern of the Bible is one of authority. When we look at the Bible as a book of morals, it means we think that we could be good enough, or at least that's what we're setting ourselves up for. That we could do enough right things to earn our reward. But God is much less concerned with morals, and he is far more concerned with authority. The whole point of the Bible is that through Christ alone can we be saved. By the authority of Christ, not our own goodness, but by his mercy. And so submission must become who we are. No part of us left out. Everything, every choice, every breath, submission to God. We must make God's will our entire being. Because Christ's sacrifice deserves our lives. And if we can do this, if we can start to fully and completely submit ourselves to God, we will be able to achieve an eternal wholeness that can never be broken. No matter what comes in our lives, no matter how much loss we face, no matter how many trials are thrown at us, if we hold to God and we submit to God above all else, he will be with us and he will protect us. He will be our refuge. With that piece of the puzzle, no obstacle will be too large because we will never be facing it alone. And so we must learn God's will. We must seek to do God's will, and we must commit ourselves to his will above all else, because without God, life is an impossible task. Now, in a moment here, we'll have a closing song. And if you're sitting there and you're realizing that you need prayers, if you're feeling lonely, we have a church family here who would love to remind you of an eternal, merciful, loving God who will help you through any trial you're facing. So I'd urge you to come forward so that we can pray for you. Or if you're sitting there and you're realizing that you are missing the most important part, the biggest puzzle piece, that is Christ Jesus, please come forward so that you can be baptized for the remission of your sins. And we can all be one under God as we stand and sing this final song.